So we're going to transition to our last panel, and we'll have some time at the end. And we hope some of you who aren't zoomed out can help us kind of think through next steps. And we have like a mini planning session and just follow up with folks. But this last panel was really about how we can support small businesses, the kinds of things we mentioned. We had a big conversation around healthcare. We've heard a lot about housing. But what are the other things that other players, NGOs and others in our community are doing to really support entrepreneurs, small business owners, and the families and workers that they employ succeed, especially in these tough times? So we're going to have a couple of panelists there. And I've asked Henry Rael with the McCune Foundation, McCune Family Foundation, which McCune Charitable Foundation, third time's the charm, and McCune, if you don't know, they have supported much of this work in the community for a long, long time on all these issues, like whether it's early childhood or how we look at economic development differently and be more inclusively. So Henry's just been doing a good job as someone who was raised in this community and who himself is an entrepreneur, who has brought very much that business mindset to how we really help our own homegrown entrepreneurs and small businesses thrive, and what do they need. So Henry's going to tell us a little bit about McCune's work, and then I'm going to turn it over to him to introduce our first panelist. So, Henry, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks everybody. What a great way to spend Friday afternoon, and this is a super important topic. Just want to highlight, as Eric mentioned, the McCune Foundation. Well, we have actually like 9 priority areas, and how can you be an expert on 9 priority areas? Not possible. But the reason that we think of it that way is really just because we think a lot about the interconnectedness of our economies and of our families, and it's really impossible to think about economic development without also thinking about family stability, thinking about education, thinking about the environment, thinking about education. I think that's a theme that's really sort of echoed and reverberated in this conversation, that it's not enough to think about things in silos. And so when we at McCune, we fund a lot of organizations that do business support and economic development support. But the one that I want to highlight is it's actually a collaborative of nonprofits, and it's called Color Theory. And what's exciting about it from the foundation's perspective is that it really seeks to sort of embody cooperative ideals and approaches when it comes to supporting small businesses. So in the chat, I just put a list of the organizations that are participating. And, McCune has supported all of these organizations pretty much over time. They all do great individual work, but we were always really curious to see how we could support them collaborating more deeply. And I think any of you who work in the nonprofit sector and deal with foundations know that foundations are really good at trying to encourage people and talk to people about collaborating, but then a lot of time foundation behavior isn't really conducive to that collaboration. And so we've really tried as a foundation to change the way that we do grant making and to really support work in this way. So, each one of these groups does great work, but when you think of putting them together in a collaboration, what does that make possible? So Color Theory actually was investigating that question. The name Color Theory came from a conversation where a number of us leaders of these organizations were sort of brainstorming, and about the question came up, what would really happen if people of color were given the ability to make decisions and design programs that they thought were really relevant for their own communities. So that was the theory. It was a color theory that, our theory was that if people of color were able to actually be in these leadership positions, it could lead to different outcomes. So it's one thing to just partner and sort of have a monthly meeting and talk about how you're working together. But what really differentiates this group is that they really sought to create structures that would bind their work together in ways that would both create efficiencies and potential economies of scale, but would also leave something behind if you had turnover in organizations. Often when you have collaborations that are effective, a lot of it's driven by the relationships of the leadership. but what happens when leaders leave? So the idea here was really like, how do you actually build structures, shared structures among these organizations so that if leaders do depart, these structures remain? And so some of the structures that I'm talking about, the groups started off by really coming to common language. When you go, that's one thing that I've noticed, when I go to different organizations, there's certain language that they'll use that's the same, but a lot of times there's different language that they use. What do they mean by access to capital? And when they talk about capital, what do they mean by that? So they started first with the process of making sure that they were all speaking the same language, that when they talked about sort of entrepreneurial pathways, that they all meant the same thing. And that was huge. And that took a lot of time to really kind of come to those agreements. And then the next big conversation was about data and data systems, and really investigating how do we actually create shared data systems so that if somebody walks into West, for example, and gets some help, but then they need to go and, for example, to the South Valley Economic Development Center to maybe focus more on food, how are we able to then connect that work directly to the South Valley Economic Development Center without them having to walk in the door a complete stranger? Just to, quickly, the way that the partnership works is West, provides things like technical assistance and incubation. They're very good at that. The New Mexico Dream Team had put together a really great access to capital program. Encuentro was working in community development and advocacy. The South Valley Economic Development Center and RGCDC, obviously with technical assistance and business incubation. The American Indian Chamber of Commerce was focused on business development in indigenous communities. The New Mexico Immigrant Law Center, legal aid. And then Siembra Leadership High School has an entrepreneurship curriculum. So rather than each one of these organizations having to be an expert on all of these things, through the trust and the shared structures that they've created, they're able to share clients across the different organizations and build efficiencies and economies of scale. So this is an example of how nonprofits serving businesses can behave in cooperative ways that creates sort of more impact across their work. I'm personally very curious to see how small businesses and small enterprises can follow the same sort of approach and figure out how they can bring their businesses together to share structures, to share capacities, and maybe to build bigger client bases.